When two officers arrested her, they had no idea they'd face her again, this time in court as the judge deciding their fate. The park was alive with laughter and life, but all of it seemed to stop as two officers approached Camille, their steps heavy with authority. She sat on a bench near the pond, her book resting in her lap. She didn't move. There was no reason to. "Ma'am, stand up," one officer commanded sharply. His partner stood a step behind, scanning the area as though expecting trouble. Camille looked up, her calm demeanor masking the unease rising in her chest. "Excuse me? Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady. "We got a report of suspicious activity," the officer replied. "We need to see some ID." A few onlookers slowed their steps, their curious glances turning to murmurs. Camille sighed and retrieved her wallet, handing over her driver's license. "I'm just sitting here reading." "Why are you here, Miss Johnson?" the officer demanded, his tone biting. "I live in this city. I came to enjoy the park," she answered evenly, though her pulse quickened. The first officer's eyes narrowed. "Stand up," he repeated, his hand moving to his belt. Camille froze, stunned. "I don't understand what's happening." "Stand up now," he snapped, grabbing her arm before she could respond. "You're resisting," he added loudly, though she hadn't moved. His partner took out handcuffs. Camille's voice broke through the growing murmurs. "What are you doing?" "I'm not resisting." But the cold metal snapped around her wrists. Phones came out as the small crowd recorded the scene. A man yelled, "She didn't do anything!" But the officers ignored him. They led Camille to their cruiser, her heart pounding as she glanced at the onlookers. A young woman with a phone met her gaze, a silent promise that the truth wouldn't go unheard. As the door slammed shut, Camille stared ahead, her mind racing. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Earlier that day, the park had been a sanctuary of peace. The sun filtered through the tall oak trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Camille sat on a wooden bench by the pond, her book resting comfortably in her hands. It was a rare moment for her, escaping the chaos of her life as a busy attorney to enjoy the simple pleasure of reading. Children's laughter rang out in the distance, mingling with the rhythmic crunch of joggers' shoes on the gravel path. Nearby, families picnicked under the shade, their voices a gentle hum of shared stories and laughter. Camille let herself relax, the weight of her responsibilities momentarily forgotten. But the spell was broken by the sharp screech of tires. She glanced up, her focus shattered, to see a police cruiser pulling up to the curb. Two officers stepped out, their faces hard and unreadable. Camille frowned, the tranquil atmosphere replaced by an uneasy tension. She stayed seated, her eyes flicking between the officers as they scanned the area. Then their gazes locked onto her. A sinking feeling settled in her chest as they started toward her bench. Around her, the energy in the park shifted. People paused to watch, their curiosity piqued by the sudden appearance of law enforcement. "Ma'am," one of the officers called out as they approached, "can we have a word with you?" Camille carefully closed her book, her calm demeanor masking the unease creeping into her chest. "Of course," she said, her voice steady but cautious. The second officer stepped closer, his tone clipped. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind explaining what you're doing here?" Her eyebrows furrowed. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading." She held up her book, her voice calm but firm. Their stares didn't waver. The peaceful afternoon had been shattered, and in that moment, Camille felt the weight of something much larger beginning to unfold. Camille remained seated, her calm exterior hiding the unease brewing inside her. The first officer stood in front of her, his expression stern. "Mind handing over your ID?" he asked, though it sounded more like a command than a request. Camille hesitated for a moment, glancing at the growing crowd of onlookers. She slowly reached into her bag, retrieving her wallet. "I still don't understand why this is necessary," she said, handing over her driver's license. The officer examined it, his brow furrowing as if he was deciphering a riddle. "Camille Johnson," he read aloud, the faintest edge of mockery in his tone. "What brings you here today, Miss Johnson?" Camille exhaled, her patience wearing thin. "I live here. I came to the park to read. Is that a problem?" The second officer stepped closer, his arms crossed. "We'll see," he said coldly, handing her ID back. But instead of moving on, they lingered, their questions growing sharper. "Do you always bring a book like that with you?" The first officer sneered, nodding toward the hardcover resting on the bench. "Are you alone, or are you meeting someone?" The second officer added, his hand resting deliberately on his belt. Camille's jaw tightened. She had faced tense situations before, in courtrooms, negotiating deals, confronting opposing counsel. But this was different. The power dynamic here was painfully clear, and their tone carried an edge she recognized all too well. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said firmly, her voice steady despite her growing frustration. The first officer's expression hardened. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Camille replied evenly. "I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." Her refusal seemed to escalate the situation. The first officer stepped forward, his stance menacing. The tension in the air grew heavier as Camille realized this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. Camille sat stiffly in the back seat of the police cruiser, her wrists aching from the handcuffs biting into her skin. The car smelled faintly of disinfectant, the seats cold and uninviting. Outside, the world blurred past, a mix of familiar streets and strangers who remained unaware of the injustice happening within the confines of the vehicle. She stared out the window, her reflection merging with the cityscape. The absurdity of the situation hit her like a wave. She had spent years defending clients in courtrooms, standing up for justice, and navigating the very system that now held her captive. The irony wasn't lost on her, but there was no humor in it, only anger simmering just below the surface. The officers said little as they drove. Occasionally, she caught one of them glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his gaze cold and detached. Camille met his eyes for a brief second before turning away, refusing to let her fears show. Her thoughts raced, replaying the events at the park in a loop she couldn't escape. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't a threat, and yet here she was, shackled and humiliated for daring to exist in a public space. The injustice of it all burned in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. She wouldn't let them see her break. The car slowed as they approached the station. Camille's stomach tightened as the cruiser rolled into the lot, the building looming ahead like a fortress. The vehicle came to a stop, and one of the officers exited, opening the back door. "Let's go," he said curtly, grabbing her arm with practiced indifference. Camille stumbled slightly as she stepped out, regaining her footing quickly to avoid showing any vulnerability. She held her head high as they led her through the station doors, the stark fluorescent lights inside illuminating a room filled with desks, bustling officers, and curious stares. Her heart pounded as she was marched past them, each step echoing louder than the last. She knew this was only the beginning of a long fight, one she hadn't chosen but couldn't avoid. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the station. Camille was led to the booking desk, her wrists still cuffed, the metal biting into her skin with every step. Around her, officers moved about their routines, but she could feel their occasional glances, curious, indifferent, or dismissive. She kept her head high, determined not to show the humiliation threatening to swallow her whole. "Stand here," the officer instructed, motioning to a marked spot in front of a camera. She complied, her face stoic as the flash went off, capturing her in a moment she would never forget. Next came the fingerprinting. The officer handling her hands pressed them onto the scanner with unnecessary force, the cold surface making her fingers ache. "This is routine," one officer said casually, though his tone carried an edge of smugness. Routine. The word rang hollow in Camille's mind. What part of this was routine for a woman sitting in a park, reading a book? After what felt like an eternity, she was led down a narrow hallway to a holding cell. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoing in the confined space. The cell was small and bare, just a cold metal bench bolted to the wall and fluorescent lights that buzzed relentlessly. Camille sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers said mockingly before walking away. Camille didn't respond. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Alone in the cell, she replayed the events at the park over and over in her mind. The serene afternoon shattered by screeching tires. The questions, the accusations, the escalating tension. How had it come to this? Hours passed. The only sounds were the distant hum of conversations and the occasional crackle of a police radio. Finally, a young officer approached her cell, clipboard in hand. "Miss Johnson," he said flatly, "you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Camille met his gaze, her voice sharp. "On what grounds?" "You can discuss that in court," he replied, turning away, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and the simmering determination growing within her. Camille stepped out of the station into the crisp night air, her breath visible in the chill. The ache in her wrists from the handcuffs lingered, a reminder of the hours she had spent confined. Across the parking lot, Marissa stood waiting by her car, her arms crossed tightly against the cold. Relief flooded her face when she saw Camille. "Camille!" Marissa called out, rushing over. "Are you okay?" Camille nodded, but her expression betrayed her. Her hands trembled slightly, though she forced herself to speak. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady but hollow. Marissa studied her closely as they got into the car. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine as Marissa drove. Finally, Camille spoke, her tone low but firm. "I'm not letting this slide." Marissa glanced over, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I've had enough," Camille replied, anger flickering in her voice. "They humiliated me. They treated me like a criminal for sitting in a park. I can't let this go." "You know how hard this will be," Marissa said cautiously. "I do," Camille answered, "but I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight this. I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been silenced or dismissed." Marissa didn't argue. She could see the fire in Camille's eyes, a determination that wouldn't be extinguished. That night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads, case files, and her laptop. The room was dimly lit, her shadow stretching across the walls as she worked. Her pen moved furiously across the pages, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers in the department. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through her. She was tired, humiliated, and furious. But more than anything, she was determined. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing injustice and fighting for change. As the hours passed, the only sound in the room was the scratch of her pen, the start of a battle she was prepared to win. The following morning, Camille's kitchen had transformed into a war room. Legal pads and case files were scattered across the table, her laptop open to a page of court precedents. A steaming mug of coffee sat untouched beside her as she combed through every detail of similar cases, her mind laser-focused on building an airtight argument. The video of her arrest, captured by a young woman in the park, had gone viral overnight. Messages poured into her inbox, some from friends, others from complete strangers. They expressed outrage, solidarity, and stories of their own experiences with injustice. Camille read each one, her resolve deepening with every word. By mid-morning, she began assembling her team. Calls were made to trusted colleagues who shared her commitment to justice. "This is more than just my case," she told one of them. "This is about holding the system accountable." Meanwhile, the community rallied. On social media, hashtags began trending, demanding accountability for the officers in the department. Local leaders reached out, offering their support and urging Camille to keep fighting. The video had sparked something bigger than she had expected, a movement that transcended her own story. Marissa arrived in the afternoon, carrying a bag of takeout. "You've been at this all day," she said, placing the food on the table. "You need a break." "I can't stop now," Camille replied without looking up. Her pen moved swiftly across the page, adding notes to her strategy. "There's too much at stake." Marissa sat across from her, watching as Camille worked tirelessly. "You're becoming a symbol, you know," she said quietly. "People are looking to you for hope." Camille finally looked up, her expression firm. "Then I can't afford to lose." As the days turned into weeks, her preparation became relentless. She pored over every piece of evidence, every precedent, and every procedural detail that could strengthen her case. She also attended town halls, listening to others who had faced similar injustices, and spoke at community meetings about the importance of accountability. Camille's determination was unshakable. The fight ahead was daunting, but she wasn't fighting alone. A community stood behind her, ready to see justice prevail. Weeks into her preparation, Camille sat at her desk, a stack of papers in front of her, when her phone buzzed. It was her attorney. She picked it up, expecting updates about her case. "Camille," her attorney said cautiously, "I need to tell you something." She leaned back in her chair, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What is it?" "You've been assigned as the judge for an upcoming case." Camille frowned, her pen hovering over her notes. "What does that have to do with me?" Her attorney hesitated. "The case involves the officers you're suing, Carter and Daniels. It's an internal misconduct hearing." The words hit her like a thunderclap. For a moment she was silent, processing the irony. The same officers who had humiliated her, whose actions had fueled her fight for justice, would now stand in her courtroom. "You're saying I'll be presiding over their case?" she asked, her voice measured but sharp. "Yes," the attorney confirmed. "It's unrelated to your situation, but the accusations of excessive force are serious." Camille exhaled slowly, leaning forward. The weight of this revelation settled over her. "This isn't just a coincidence," she said softly. "It's an opportunity." Her thoughts raced. Could she do this? Could she remain impartial, uphold her duty as a judge, and set aside her personal feelings? She thought about the people who had rallied behind her, the stories she had heard, and the responsibility she now carried. "This isn't about revenge," she said finally. "It's about showing them what real justice looks like." Her attorney's voice was cautious but supportive. "I believe you'll do the right thing." Camille hung up, her resolve solidifying. The road ahead had shifted, but her mission remained clear. Justice, no matter the cost. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as spectators filled the benches. News of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a larger crowd than usual for a misconduct hearing. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras poised to capture every detail. Carter and Daniels sat at the defense table, their uniforms neatly pressed, though their expressions betrayed unease. They leaned toward their lawyer, whispering in hushed tones, stealing occasional glances at the bench. Their usual confidence seemed shaken. When the door to the judge's chambers opened, the room fell silent. Camille stepped out, her black robe flowing as she ascended to the bench. Her expression was calm, commanding, and unreadable. She scanned the room briefly before speaking. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers stiffened as they sank into their chairs, their discomfort palpable. Camille allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of her presence settle over the room before signaling for the prosecutor to begin. The prosecutor rose, his tone firm and direct. "Your Honor, this case is about accountability. The actions of Officers Carter and Daniels demonstrate a flagrant abuse of power, undermining the trust placed in them by the community." As he laid out his evidence, Camille listened intently, her pen gliding across her notepad. Occasionally, her eyes flicked toward the defendants. Carter fidgeted with his hands, his gaze darting nervously. Daniels sat rigid, his jaw clenched tightly. The defense attorney rose next, his voice steady but strained. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident, we contend that the officers' actions were not malicious but the result of a tense and unpredictable situation." Camille remained composed, absorbing every word, but inside she couldn't ignore the echoes of her own experience. The justifications, the excuses, they were painfully familiar. The tension in the room thickened as the hearing progressed. The defendants' discomfort grew with each piece of evidence presented, their previously unshakable confidence eroding. Camille's presence alone seemed to unsettle them, a constant reminder of the power dynamics that had shifted. As the day drew to a close, Camille adjourned the session. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced, her voice steady. She watched as Carter and Daniels exited the courtroom, their steps heavy, knowing this fight was far from over. The prosecutor called the first witness to the stand, a young man named Ethan. His steps were hesitant, his hands fidgeting as he adjusted the microphone. Camille observed him carefully, her expression neutral but attentive. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Ethan," the prosecutor began, his tone steady, "can you describe what happened the night you encountered Officers Carter and Daniels?" Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. "I was driving home after work. They pulled me over, said it was a routine stop. I didn't think much of it, so I complied with everything they asked. What happened next? The prosecutor asked, leaning in slightly. Ethan's voice wavered. They told me to step out of the car. I did. I didn't argue or resist, but before I could even ask why, they grabbed me. One of them shoved me against the hood, and the other pulled out his baton. It felt like they'd already decided I was a threat. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Ethan. Camille noted his trembling hands, the fear in his eyes. It was a fear she recognized. Did you resist their orders at any point? The prosecutor pressed. No, Ethan said firmly. I did exactly what they told me, but it didn't matter. They didn't listen. They didn't care. The prosecutor nodded and turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. When the defense attorney rose, his approach was calculated. Ethan, he began, his voice calm. You said you complied. But isn't it possible the officers perceived a threat you weren't aware of? Ethan shook his head. Number I didn't do anything threatening. I wasn't aggressive. But emotions run high in these situations, the attorney continued, pushing. Could your body language have been misinterpreted? No, Ethan said firmly, his voice steady now. They didn't give me a chance to explain. The prosecutor's case continued to build as more witnesses took the stand, painting a damning picture of the officer's actions. Camille listened intently, her focus unshakable. The parallels between Ethan's experience and her own were unmistakable, each testimony reigniting the fire of her resolve. By the end of the day, it was clear. The officer's actions were not isolated incidents. They were part of a dangerous pattern. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Officer Carter was called to the stand. His movements were slow, his shoulders slouched as he made his way forward. He swore the oath, his voice barely audible, and sat down, avoiding Camille's gaze. The prosecutor wasted no time. Officer Carter, you're accused of using excessive force during this incident. Can you explain your actions? Carter hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Daniels at the defense table before responding. I believe the situation was escalating, he said, his voice shaky. I made a judgment call. The prosecutor's gaze narrowed. And do you believe that judgment call was justified? At the time, yes, Carter replied, his confidence wavering. But looking back, I could have handled it differently. The prosecutor leaned in slightly. Handled it differently how? By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground? Carter's mouth opened, but no words came out. His silence was deafening, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Next, Daniels took the stand. Unlike Carter, his demeanor was defensive, his responses clipped. I was following protocol, he stated firmly. The situation was unpredictable. Unpredictable? The prosecutor echoed, his tone sharp. You were dealing with a compliant individual. What exactly was unpredictable about that? Daniels shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. We had to make a split-second decision. We believed there was a threat. And yet, the prosecutor said, his voice cutting through the silence, no threat was found, no weapon, no aggression, nothing. So how do you justify your actions? Daniel's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Carter before responding. We acted based on the information we had at the time. Camille watched their testimonies closely, her face unreadable. But inside, frustration bubbled. The excuses, the lack of accountability, it was all too familiar. By the time the officers stepped down, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. Their attempts to defend themselves had only deepened the cracks in their credibility, leaving them exposed. The courtroom was silent as Camille entered to deliver her ruling. Every seat was filled, the tension palpable as reporters lined the back wall, ready to document the outcome. The case had grown beyond a misconduct hearing. It was now a symbol of accountability, a turning point for the community. Camille's expression was calm but resolute as she took her seat. She glanced briefly at the defense table, where Carter and Daniel sat, their postures tense, their faces pale. Their lawyer leaned in, whispering something, but the officers didn't respond. They stared ahead, waiting. She began, her voice steady and deliberate. The role of law enforcement is to serve and protect the community with integrity, fairness, and respect. When this duty is compromised, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victims. The officer's discomfort was visible as Camille's words landed with weight. She continued, "The evidence presented in this case has demonstrated that Officers Carter and Daniels acted with unnecessary force, disregarding their training and the protocols they were sworn to uphold." She paused, allowing the silence to amplify her next words. Their actions were not justifiable and reflect a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored. Camille took a deep breath and announced the consequences. This court orders mandatory suspension without pay for both officers, enrollment in extensive retraining programs, and the inclusion of a formal disciplinary record in their files. A collective murmur spread through the room, relief from some, quiet acceptance from others. Camille's ruling struck a balance between accountability and the opportunity for reform. Before adjourning, Carter stood hesitantly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." Camille met his gaze, her expression steady. "Words alone cannot rebuild trust," she said. "That comes through actions." With a decisive strike of the gavel, Camille ended the proceedings. As the room emptied, she remained seated for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. Justice had been served, but the victory felt bittersweet. For every case like this, there were countless others that would never see a courtroom. She exhaled slowly, knowing her fight wasn't over. This was just one step in a long battle for systemic change. The days following the ruling were a whirlwind of reactions. News of Camille's decision spread quickly, igniting debates across the city. Some saw it as a fair resolution, a necessary step toward accountability, while others questioned whether it went far enough. For Camille, it wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about doing what was right. The community rallied around her. Town hall meetings grew crowded, voices rising as people shared their stories of injustice. Camille listened intently, taking notes and absorbing every word. Each story was a reminder of the systemic flaws she had set out to challenge. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for them. One evening, at a packed community meeting, an elderly woman approached Camille. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "What you did, it gives us hope." Camille smiled softly, her throat tight. "We still have a long way to go," she replied, her voice steady. "But change is possible if we keep pushing." Social media continued to amplify the impact. The video of her arrest, now juxtaposed with her ruling, became a powerful symbol of resilience and justice. Activists organized rallies, demanding broader reforms in law enforcement policies, while local leaders sought Camille's guidance on implementing accountability measures. Marissa often checked in, urging Camille to take breaks. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she reminded her, but Camille rarely slowed down. "I can rest when we've made real progress," she would reply, her determination unwavering. The ripple effect of her fight was undeniable. Conversations about systemic change had reached new heights, and Camille found herself at the center of it all. Not because she sought the spotlight, but because her story had become a rallying cry for those who felt unheard. As she reflected on the journey, Camille knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, she felt the weight of possibility. Change was slow, but it was happening, and she was determined to see it through. Camille stood on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the square. Nearby, a group of young activists held signs demanding reform, their voices ringing with determination. She watched them for a moment, a flicker of hope warming her heart. Turning to the gathered crowd, she began to speak, her voice calm but powerful. "This fight is not just about one case or one ruling. It's about accountability, fairness, and the belief that justice should serve everyone, not just a select few." The crowd quieted, hanging on to her words. "We've taken a step forward, but the journey is far from over. Real change doesn't happen in a day. It happens when we, as a community, refuse to accept the status quo." She scanned the faces before her, seeing not just supporters, but allies in a collective struggle. Each of us has a role to play, whether it's sharing a story, raising a voice, or challenging systems of inequality. Every action matters. Together, we can push for a world where fairness isn't the exception, but the rule. The applause was thunderous, but Camille remained steady. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a movement for true justice.